One of the core tenets of American society is the patriarchal, heterosexual, monogamous nuclear family. Queer theory challenges the normalization of this idea and suggests that lesbian and gay families, families without kids, and a variety of other diverse ways of relating, being in community, and structuring a familial unit can be equally valid. In this video, I will use a queer theory lens in examining the messages about the nuclear family in two scary movies for children, Coraline and ParaNorman. Both were released by Leica Studios, both have a PG rating, and they were released within a few years of each other. Coraline was directed by Henry Selick, a straight man, and was released in 2009, while ParaNorman was co-directed by Chris Butler, a gay man, and Sam Fell, a straight man, and released in 2012. I will be looking at how Coraline and ParaNorman either advance or disrupt the normalization of the patriarchal, heterosexual, monogamous nuclear family. Let's begin with Coraline. In this film, a young girl named Coraline moves to an old house that has been converted into an apartment building. Her parents are very busy, so she gets bored and explores the rest of the house, meeting the neighbors and the boy who lives next door, Wybie. She finds a small door that seems to not lead anywhere. When she wakes up in the middle of the night, a passageway is open, and she enters essentially a parallel universe version of her family's apartment, complete with a new set of parents, the other mother and the other father. These parents are very attentive to Coraline, even redesigning the garden in her likeness. Coraline wants to stay with the other parents permanently, but when she learns that would mean replacing her eyes with button eyes like theirs, she changes her mind. However, the other mother does not relent easily. She locks Coraline in a mirror where she meets the ghost children, children who had their eyes along with their souls stolen by the other mother, who is actually called the Beldam. The other Wybie helps Coraline escape, and Wybie's cat gives her techniques and assistance in eventually defeating the Beldam in her most frightening spider form. Lindsay Myers argues that Coraline promotes conservative family values over more progressive ideals and fuels rather than challenges contemporary anxieties about the breakdown of the family. Selick's film is highly critical of Coraline's real parents. It goes so far as to suggest that Coraline's vulnerability was the direct result of parental shortcomings, and it is especially critical of modern mothers who do not have time to tend to their children's needs due to work commitments. She explains this claim by describing how Coraline's real parents' inattentiveness causes her to explore the house and puts her at risk in the first place. The other mother exploits the negative emotions Coraline has with that lack of attention to try to get her to stay. And at the end of the film, the defeat of the threat of the other mother is paralleled with Coraline's parents becoming more attentive to her needs, implying the need for parents to be highly attentive to their children to remove threats to their safety. The nuclear family is upheld as the only safe space, and disconnection from that nuclear family is seen as good reason to be afraid. Furthermore, while there is representation of a variety of family structures, or at least living situations, with Coraline living with her parents, Wybie living with his grandmother, the downstairs neighbors living together as two women, and the upstairs neighbor living with just his mice, most of the attitude towards and portrayal of these people is negative, or at least very odd. For instance, Coraline's mother expresses with disgust this view about the upstairs neighbor.
Call him crazy, Coraline. He's drunk.
Even the traditional patriarchal view of women as weak and in need of protection plays a role in Coraline. James Curtis concludes that, by effectively making Wybie the hero and primary mover of the film, Selick creates a repeated need for male salvation, which places Coraline in a dependent position that effaces her identity entirely. In other words, the way that Selick's film constructs gender on a fundamental level is to assert that females are the passive recipients of the action that their male counterparts must inevitably initiate and perpetuate. He makes his argument by describing the various ways that Wybie and his cat assist Coraline in escaping and defeating the other mother, removing most of Coraline's agency in the story. Overall, Coraline relentlessly promotes the nuclear family ideal to the exclusion of all other family structures, and doesn't challenge any facet of it, but especially maintains patriarchy and heteronormativity. Now, let's take a look at ParaNorman. The film ParaNorman centers around a boy named Norman who inherited a socially undesirable ability to talk to ghosts. His uncle had the same ability, and therefore also the responsibility of, each year, quelling the rage of the ghost of Agatha Prendergast, a girl who was killed centuries ago because of her ability to talk to ghosts, which was seen as witchcraft. When Norman's uncle dies, he passes this responsibility on to Norman. Norman tries to do his task as his uncle instructed by reading the required fairy tale where he assumed Agatha was buried, the graveyard. However, he learns that, even in death, witches were seen as too different to be buried among the other humans, and so the attempt fails. Agatha rises and rages against the city as Norman tries to figure out where she was actually buried. However, he eventually realizes that reading the fairy tale is not a beneficial solution, and he decides to talk to Agatha, outcast kid to outcast kid. The film ends on a note of acceptance, with Agatha accepting what happened and realizing that hurting those who hurt her doesn't help anyone. And as Norman says,
There's always someone out there for you.
which he gets to experience as his family accepts him, strange abilities and all. In considering this film through the lens of queer theory, it is important to note this scene at the end of the film.
Sounds great, Kathy. You know, you're gonna love my boyfriend.
But while representation is a great start, I want to look deeper. Like Coraline, ParaNorman ends on a note of happiness and safety that is represented by the nuclear family coming together. However, the primary message of the film is not about the nuclear family, but rather about acceptance of those who don't fit societal expectations, including Norman himself. As one example, Norman's dad expresses his distaste in Norman's talking to Ghost at the beginning of the film in this scene.
That limp-wristed hippie garbage needs to be nipped in the bud.
Interestingly, he uses language that is often used to refer to gay men. This negative attitude does change by the end of the film, where the dad acknowledges the ghost grandma. But the point is Norman's dad's acceptance of differences, not the protective forces of the nuclear family. This is clear because none of the conflicts in the story are driven by the familial disconnect. Rather, the conflict between Agatha and the deceased town officials, who killed her for her supernatural abilities, drives the story. Throughout Norman's process of addressing the situation with Agatha, he also relies heavily on those outside his nuclear family. Norman speaks to the deceased town officials who had Agatha killed, and they serve as what Philip Gordon terms social ghosts. Social ghosts are able to apply the perspectives developed in the past and bring retrospect to current events. Gordon explains, the social ghost has tremendous power to bring about change through the communion they make with the living, for those more ensconced in society, rather than overlooked by it. That communion occurs in the face of a crisis which can only be solved through the shared supernatural vision which that communion allows. Connections with the deceased is a positive force throughout the film, which emphasizes the importance of relations outside the nuclear family unit. In ParaNorman, the nuclear family is viewed as positive, and there's nothing wrong with that. The important thing is that the emphasis is on acceptance and connection that is not limited to the nuclear family, and therefore that is more inclusive of queer relationships even beyond the surface level representation. In summary, Coraline most strongly maintains the dominant ideal of the patriarchal, heterosexual, monogamous nuclear family. ParaNorman values that ideal, but also values alternate ways to structure family and relate to people. Thank you for watching.